Hello everyone and welcome to the first Raahi Reflections video, where we will take one of the episodes of the Raahi Impact Journeys podcast and go deeper, reflecting on some of the highlights and trying to interpret some takeaways from it. So today we will be looking at the conversation with Professor Ankur Sarin, Classrooms, Boardrooms and Social Impact. And if you haven't checked it out, please do go check it out. And if you have, let's dive in.
We forget in some ways the most important person in all of this, which is the child, right? Whenever we are talking about systems, the child comes last, right? And I think that's where I would, in some ways credit Amit, who comes here and he narrates his story of this center, the small center, right? Small in terms of size, in terms of students, but I mean, huge in terms of what the nature of what they're trying to do. If the obsession is first with scale, and then with the child, then the child will always get neglected, right? But if you put the child first and then say, yes, there are many children out there, right? But then you create a system which recognizes, the uniqueness, the diversity and all of that, because then you create a system with that objective of nurturing the child. You don't create a system for the sake of creating a system.
So Professor Sarin makes this point that we need to keep the child at the center of the education system and not create a system for the sake of creating a system. In all the years that I've worked in education, I have found this thought to be extremely powerful and extremely true. The thing is that India has about 250 million children going to school, to about 1.5 million schools across 28 states and 8 union territories. Now, when you look at the staggering scale of one of the world's largest education systems, it's easy to reduce individual children into statistics. And while statistics are useful to manage complexity at scale, it's also important to once in a while zoom in and remember that every data point is an individual child or an individual teacher with their own hopes and dreams and fears and neurodiversity, their own starting points and socioeconomic conditions. And when we are designing a solution for them, we need to make sure that the solution works for them. Let me give you an example. So think back to the time during COVID when all governments and institutions were trying to enable online classes for the children and conduct examinations online. What was the point of what we were trying to do? We were trying to ensure that every child is able to continue to progress in their learning during that period. But if you only track number of hours of classes taught, number of teachers trained, number of hours of learning that supposedly happened, it may not be a good enough way for you to truly understand whether the child has actually been able to engage in the class meaningfully and learn. Did the child have enough of a data pack for them to be able to engage in the classroom during a 40-minute session? Was the child in a mind space where the child was able to focus on class when there were other things happening in the house? And was the child able to take an exam, let's say an 8-year-old, taking an online exam in a language that is foreign to them on their tiny phones with their shaky internet? Did that really work? It's going to be important for us to keep the lens of the purpose of learning for the child, for every child, and progress in understanding and skills and competencies for every child as we look at creating systems. So Professor Sarin also mentions Amit Sriyam, who we saw in a different episode, and talks about a little grove, the place which largely caters to students for whom the school system just does not work. And if I were to turn this into a solution-oriented conversation, if you are designing anything in education at scale or virtually, I would urge you to ask yourself 3 questions. First, do you truly understand your end user? Do you understand what their world looks like? Do you know what it means to walk in their shoes? Second, once you do understand what it means to walk in their shoes, can you think about whether the solution is truly contextualized and localized to the level possible as you are creating the solution? And third, and this is the most important one, would you be comfortable if this were an intervention that was done for your loved ones, your nephew, your niece, your child? Would this solution be good enough? And using these three lenses, I hope you will be able to create a robust, meaningful, contextual solution that works for what you are trying to ultimately enable for that child and that teacher within the education system.
So I'm not very comfortable with the distinction between social impact versus other sectors. I truly believe, and to the extent that I just take it as the absolute truth, that all corporations, every entity has a social impact. The question is, what is the nature of the social impact that you want to be creating and you want to be working towards, right? So I think, I think no one should be, no graduate or no one should be under the impression that somehow they are not doing something which is socially impactful. And I think that consciousness needs to be imbibed to start with. This also goes back to your earlier question, right?
Yeah. Everything that you do has a tangible impact on society, even though you may not see it.
Right. And moreover, what you are also doing is changing and reflecting society in some form, right? Are you reinforcing status quo? Are you, reinforcing sort of hierarchies, or are you trying to challenge that, right? So I think those are things that even no matter which business one is engaged in, they can be thinking about those issues.
So this one was a bit of a miss at my end. So I usually think of organizations as social impact organizations and other organizations, businesses, corporates, people who are doing something else. But the conversation with Professor Sarin helped to reframe that understanding, that every institution, organization, individual, by the very fact of their existence and their actions, is having a tangible social and environmental impact. Now, in practice, these are often relegated as externalities, positive or negative externalities, but in truth, they are having an impact on the world. So it helps to bring home the fact that every choice, every decision, every product and service that we help bring into the world is shaping society in some sense. It is changing consumer behavior. It is cutting down trees or planting trees or degrading water bodies and so on, or giving employment, changing the nature of employment, and many, many unseen, unspoken changes that happen due to their existence. Now, I thought it's a helpful reminder that we need to think about using our position and privilege in our jobs to help take society forward in a way that we think would be ideal and beneficial for everyone.
More fundamentally, we've got to change aspirations. Aspirations both that the institute has for the students and the students have for themselves. I really think, we need to, in some sense as an institution, need to adopt more 21st century goals than stick to the 20th century goals that perhaps shape the institution to start with, right? I think the institution has done enough, or it showed its capability in creating partners, CEOs, and students, so now, there are others doing it as well, right? And even as a student, another partner coming out from the institute, great. It's not an easy achievement. I don't want to devalue the achievement, but if we have to continue to be, leaders, right? There are far more complex problems that need solving. It's a question of, well, here are where the problems are, the complex problems, the challenging problems, and this is where your intellect, your smartness needs to be put in, right?
So I don't have much to add on to this, but I thought it was a point worth calling out. I agree completely with Professor Ankur Sarin that the social sector is where there are a lot of wicked problems, a lot of long-term, complex, intractable challenges, which require a lot of judgment, and there are no clear right or wrong answers. And that makes it the perfect testing ground for someone who wants to call themselves a seasoned management professional. But there is a question whether our institutions are preparing its graduates for a life that would be oriented towards tackling social issues, having the skills and the perspectives to understand social structures, and to be able to engage with these questions meaningfully. So if you are someone who is working in an academic institution, maybe two things you could do is, one, actively help the students engage and work towards such social issues so that they may build their skills and their perspectives on this. And second, even if you are not actively working on it, provide support and backing to those who are engaging within the campus.
See, so yes, that's what I have also been taught in some ways, that the business of business is to do business, and when we say to do business is to maximize shareholder value, right? And this has been taught as a axiom, as sort of a truth, which is, yes, of course, this is what it is, and this is how the world works. But my contention is that most economic activity, at least in terms of number of people doing it, I don't know in terms of gross value addition and all of that, is actually not driven per se by a profit maximization motive. Yes, there is a profit motive. There is a desire to be covering costs. There is a desire to be sort of meeting expenses, living a decent life. But the idea of profit maximization is a very different one from sort of saying, hey, we need to make profits as well, right? And I think so. This is again a part of the disciplining or training that happens. That no, it is only about profit maximization. In which case, you just keep aside everything else, other than what folk who the interests of capital. I think most people are pursuing the desire to live a decent, happy life, right? And nobody is saying, am I making the most out of the money that I'm spending, right? Or if I'm running a sort of a small Airbnb, am I making the most money that I can out of that, right? They're doing it out of some degree of happiness. And I think that's the part that higher education, our schooling, in some ways is just erasing. And that's the part that I'm most worried about.
The first time that I heard about the profit motive of businesses was during my MBA. And somewhere along the line after that, I seem to have absorbed this idea that businesses have to be about profit maximization, and it has to be about running the most efficient ship possible. That's why the conversation with Professor Sarin was a little bit of a light bulb moment for me, because it helped reframe that again and helped me see that for most businesses, most traditional businesses, it may not be about maximizing profit. Let me give you an example to illustrate this. A friend of mine was taking over his dad's milling business. And so when he looked at the business, he was aghast. He saw that there were these vaguely worded vendor contracts which had scope for improvement. There were the not so efficient employees still working in the organizations after years of mediocre service and so on. It took him a while to realize that for his father, it wasn't all about maximizing profit. It was not just an economic activity. Running the business was a social activity. For him, it was about the relationships he had with all these people that he had met over the years. It was about supporting the families of his employees, and in all of this, making a decent life for himself and his family. And this may be the story for many, many other businesses that aren't following the idea of maximizing profit and squeezing the last paisa from their customers. Now the question becomes, where did I pick up this idea of businesses are about maximizing profit? So a friend of mine, a listener of this podcast, made an astute point that I wanted to share onwards with you. He said that this may not be about individual motive, but it may be something to do with the structure, the societal structure in which we are operating. He said that in a capitalist system, which is what we are moving towards, price becomes primary because if one person makes their ship more efficient or finds a way to reduce their prices, others are also forced to find a way to do the same. And the primary point around which all of the competition evolves is going to be the price point. And in the long run, it leads to a race where everyone races to reduce their prices, leading them to also minimize their costs, putting pressure internally, and ultimately focusing on maximizing their profits which are reducing over time. I thought this was an interesting perspective worth forwarding onward to you. It's really disempowering, or it's really disheartening many times when you have been breaking your head against a wall, whether it is people who don't understand what you are trying to do, or whether it is the systems are so unfair or biased and there is only so much that an individual is able to do. I sometimes get that feeling despite, everything that I try, that the problem is very wicked. So how do you deal, what is that emotional state that you go through perhaps? And if it is similar, then how do you deal with it?
No, you're right. You just can't deny that part of it. When I used to go attend sort of a lot of the NGO gatherings and all of that, right, community-based organizations, and there would be this singing, and there would be this sort of, a certain degree of like introductions, and it's only now I realize what all that was for. It's a way to create solidarity and bonding, which perhaps helps us deal with otherwise very depressing stories that one also hears, along with all the inspirational stuff. And the sheer complexity in trying to bring about change, right? I think personally, I don't know whether it's helped me or this is, it's a reflection of my cynicism, but I sometimes envy folk who, are able to say, hey, this is the change I seek 5 years later, 10 years later, or have a particular goal in mind and then they seek themselves working towards it, right? I've never been that individual. And so, in a sense, that perhaps to some extent protects me from being able to, get completely depressed. On a daily basis, when you meet people, and you meet just even if it's another student, who's thinking, who's questioning, right? And I think that's what lets you, take each day at a time. But yeah, you're right. It does get depressing, very depressing at times.
And in fact, I think one of the recent conversations that's happening in the nonprofit sector is an awareness and acknowledgement and realization, and therefore then eventually action on burnout. People who care end up choosing roles where they try to directly work towards bettering other people's lives, because whenever they can. And then when they keep trying, you throw yourself entirely at it. So, and then at some point it starts to pinch. So this was a poignant moment for me in the podcast. Social problems are inherently complex and long-term. And that means that it might take years, if not decades, for an idea to translate into policy that has been implemented well, or for a solution that has been adopted by most of the population, so that the social problem that we are addressing has been largely taken care of. And in that meanwhile, it might seem interminable, the wait to see that solution fully implemented. It might seem enervating and disempowering for us to see that the social problems are still all around us, despite the amount of effort and time that we have invested into it. And so I want to share 3 things that might be meaningful for you to hear. First, personally, every time that I've stayed up at night wondering, is any of the work that I'm doing even having any impact at all, I have found that it is very helpful to engage in impact tracking, which is to look at what was the theory of the impact that I was trying to create, and seeing where we are in that journey and getting milestones to get a sense of where we are and what course to take for us to move forward. And we will talk about this separately in a different video, so we can go deeper in that, but I just wanted to share the thought with you in case it helps you as well. Second, remember that it is a marathon, not a sprint, which means that like the 42 kilometers of a marathon, you're taking 42 years of your career to deal with something like this. Direct implication would be that you need to pace yourself. You need to make sure that you're not killing yourself every day to the point that you are burning out. And each one of us takes care of our own energy in a different way. I would encourage you to find your way that will help you to heal from the efforts that you have taken and feel energized so that you can engage further and continue to engage in the work that you need to do. And finally, find your tribe. As Professor Sarin said, what helps as we are engaging in these difficult problems is finding a set of people who you enjoy working with, enjoy walking the journey with. And like someone said, it's not about the journey or the destination, it's about the company. So consider finding an organization or a set of people who are your compatriots, who you can work with so that you feel happy in the space that you're working in. So that's it. Those are some of the highlights of the episode with Professor Ankur Sarin, Classrooms, Boardrooms and Social Impact. Now, if you haven't seen the full conversation, please do check it out. And if there are other highlights that come out from your viewing of the conversation, please do drop them in the comments below. Would love to hear from you and would love to keep this conversation alive. Thank you and see you again soon.